good day to brew, baby? What is up, YouTube's Roy Millsy, my hometown commander, and we are back for another episode of Millsy Brews, the show where I brew my version 1.0 deck list of the commander in front of us on my quest to out-brew your favorite Magic gentlemen. We are in the middle of covering March of the Machine, the Aftermath. And I've been pretty excited. There's been some interesting commanders for sure as far as Aftermath goes, and I think there's a lot of interesting new commanders for different strategies and just different ways to look at things, whether it be new 5-color commanders, which we're going to see in a week or so, and different things. But I thought, why not continue my love for talking about landfall decks and talk about Joriel, Voice of Zhalfir, 2 green blue. For 3/3 legendary human druid, says at the beginning of combat on your turn, up to one target land you control becomes an XX green and blue bird creature with flying and haste until the turn, where X is the number of cards in your hand. It's still a land. Then whenever a land creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So I kind of like Joriel because this is kind of a play on that like Oboon thing that we got back in Zendikar Rising, right? Where you turn a land into a creature at the start of your combat. Of course, in that deck, it was based on some like +1/+1 counters and things. But I like that this one's the number of cards in your hand because there's so many great ways in green and blue to draw cards, right? I like Joriel in a lot of ways because it gives you an advantage to already want to play lands anyway and already want to draw cards anyway, because now we get to do this big thing. The other cool part I think about Joriel is now we get to use all of these cards that make land creatures, and we still get to attack with them because we get to draw cards. It gives us an advantage for using them, which I think is something we don't always get, but I think now we can take really cool advantage of them. 35 lands in the mana base, playing things like Lumbering Falls, which can turn into a creature, Inkmoth Nexus, Mishra's Factory, Mutavault, a lot of lands in Blackmouth Nexus, things that can turn into creatures, Crawling Barrens, because I think they're a cheeky way to just make it into a creature, get in for some damage to somebody who maybe doesn't have a good block, and draw a card if need be, and I like that Lair of the Hydra as well. So cool little mana base. Normally landfall decks have just a few more lands than normal, but I think we don't mind because we're not playing full landfall. We're just kind of using it as a mini strategy for what we're trying to do. In the enchantments, we're trying to kind of split our time here between actual landfall strategies and then this enchantment strategy, or sorry, this land creature strategy, right? Beastmaster Ascension is going to help us when our lands eventually can get big enough to start dealing some big damage. Our opponents have to worry about that. Druid class gets us the life every time a land comes in on the front, on the little side, and then once we get up to level 3, it's actually going to allow us to make a land into a creature on its own. Garruk's Uprising giving all of our creatures trample and drawing us cards when creatures come in. Garruk's Uprising won't draw us cards on our lands becoming creatures, unfortunately, because those creatures won't be entering the battlefield. But I think that trample is going to become important for when these big land creatures start attacking our opponents and getting it for damage. Harmonious Emergence seems kind of interesting. We can make a land into a spirit with vigilance and haste. I kind of like it, and because it makes it into a creature, but the bottom thing says if the enchanted land would be destroyed, instead sacrifice this, and that land gets indestructible for a turn. So I kind of like it because it gives it a little bit of protection. Yes, at the end of the day, we're taking a land and we're turning it into a creature. It makes it vulnerable, but I think it's an interesting way to kind of give us some advantage to attack. Imprison in the Moon and Canvas Transformation for a little bit of removal. Nature's Revolt, a card that probably only sees play here because it turns all of our lands into creatures. So that's a way to kind of activate all of our lands and let them attack. Again, at the same time, we're turning them from lands into creatures, which means we need to be careful because we'll be susceptible to board wipes. So I think a card like this is definitely something we need to deploy at the right time, as opposed to just slamming it down whenever we can. Reconnaissance Mission, getting us a card every time we deal combat damage to a player. I like stuff like this in the deck, and I thought about putting more in, but I didn't like it. It's a good idea because then we could draw more and have more for the time we activate Joriel's ability, but I just think the good part here is no matter what we do, we're going to try to get in, draw a card or two for our trouble of hitting someone, and then get that value. Retreat to Coral Home, one of those cards that just becomes really good. Whenever land enters the battlefield, we either tap or untap a creature or scry one. I like this because you get a chance to scry off the top of your deck if that's something you wanted to do, or you can tap or untap a creature. This is great with tapping down your opponent's things, untapping your own things to tap for more mana. I think Coral Home It does a lot of interesting things in a lot of decks. Of course, there's a bunch of combos with Coral Helm. We're not getting into that as much as probably some other landfall decks would, but I like the versatility of it. And then Roaring Earth. Whenever a land comes in, put a counter on a creature we control, and then we can channel it to make a creature a land, a land a creature, and that's pretty good. I think the front ability is pretty good as well, just to puff up our creatures, make our creatures harder to deal with. Not too many artifacts. Again, we're playing landfalls. We're playing a lot of these ramp things as opposed to artifacts, but Arcane Signet, Soul Ring, of course, are the usual suspects. Decanter of Endless Water is going to give us no maximum hand size. This is great. So, of course, the more we draw with Jolrael, the less we have to worry about discarding down hand size. And the bigger that land's going to become every turn we get to deploy it. Binding of Thoughts, another way to draw a card another way to draw a card on our combat damage, so that's going to help us grow our hand. And then I thought I'd give Staff of Titania a shot here, +6/+X, where it's the number of force you control, and then whenever you attack, you make a land creature. I like this because, again, we're getting those land creatures, we're getting more value, but also we're playing a ton of forests, and we're playing things like, Yavimaya, so we have a chance to just make all of our lands into forests. So it's going to make it even harder to deal with. So I like something like Staff of Titania. I think it's a fun, interesting card here. You put this on your commander, potentially, and start hitting for commander damage you want to. You put this on a creature that's already maybe middle of the range / bigger, and you make it even bigger. I like stuff like this. I had also really considered Blackblade Reforged as well, just because we're probably going to have enough lands anyway, but it just didn't make the cut for what I was trying to do. Getting into the instance, we have a couple different types of instance here. We have removal, we have a ramp. Let's go for the removal first. Reality Shift to Exile, Rapid Hybrid, and Pongify are going to be our destroy removals for creatures, both 1 mana, and I feel like they're going to fit really well. Nature's Claim, going to take out an artifact or enchantment, which is important for 1 mana because I think it's going to help stop combos, stop playlines for our opponents, kind of throw our opponents off for what we need. Beast Within can hit anything, gives the opponent that 3/3 beast for the trouble, and then we're trying to filter out from the aftermath set. I think this card's kind of interesting. It's kind of a strict replacement for Cyclonic Rift in a lot of ways. Return all non-creature, non-land permanents to owner's hand. Some people don't like Cyclonic Rift, whether it's for its price or for the negative salt connotation that comes with it. I think Filter Out's an interesting replacement, and I thought I'd throw it in here just to see what it looks like in a list. But I like this because it's non-creature, non-land, so what we can do is turn our lands into creatures. They get out of the way of this either way, but then we might be able to pick our opponents, pick up their ghostly prisons or pick up some things that are locking us down, and then boom, now might potentially have a free reign to get in there for an attack. Brainstorm for some draw. Crop Rotation is mainly in here to go get that Yavimaya if we need to turn all of our lands into the forest. We're also, and we'll talk about when we get up top, playing that new Nissa that cares about forests as well. So I think Crop Rotation's in here too. Go get that Yavimaya if need be. Growth Spiral, one of my favorite ramp cards. Draw a card, put a land from our hand onto the battlefield. We can do this on anyone's turn. I just like it. It gets you another card into your hand if need be, and then you get that extra land drop. Joint Exploration does something very similar. Scry 2 and then draw, and then if we kick it, we pay that 3rd mana. We can put a land from our hand down onto the battlefield. Natural Affinity. Telling to turn all of our lands become creatures that are still land. I like a card like this because if we have the right board state, if we have the right attacks, man, this is great, right? Turn all of our lands into creatures and get swinging. I like this because if you think about it, this is kind of a in a deck like this, if we have Garruk's Uprising out, if we have Beastmaster Ascension out, I think Natural Affinity is kind of like a Triumph of the Hordes or an Overrun. If you think about it, we're going to turn all of our creatures into all of our lands into creatures, make them big, and just start swinging, and then our opponents have to deal with it. Rampage and Growth is kind of cool. This is from Jumpstart. It says, search your library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle until at a turn that land becomes a 4/3 with reach and haste. It's still a land. This is pretty cool because then in this deck we get attack with it right away and get the benefit of potentially drawing a card with Joriel if she's out. And then Venge and Earth. Creature land you control becomes a 4/4 elemental with haste, and it has to be blocked this turn if able. This is kind of cool because we could turn a land into a creature, get in with somebody, or make somebody forced to make a bad block, potentially. But I like it just because for 2 mana we can get a 4/4 land creature and then potentially draw with Joriel. Getting into our sorceries, and here's where we have an interesting mix of just straight ramp and then some fun interesting cards. Let's go with the ramp first because this is most of the cards. Awaken the Woods does twofold in this deck. 1, it ramps us, and 2, it makes land creatures. So this is great because we get all of the ramp that those forest land creatures would give us, but we also then get all of this these land creatures that if they hit somebody are going to draw a card with Joriel. So I really like Awaken the Woods in here because it kind of does double time. Cultivate far as he could on his reach. Emergent Sequence is kind of fun. It goes and gets a basic land, but then that land turns into a 0/0 creature with plus one counters equal to the number of lands that enter the battlefield under our control this turn. That's kind of cool. That could do us some good depending on how many lands come up. We can get a pretty big land, and it stays a land, so we don't have to keep animating it or anything like that. Explore, kind of the sorcery version of Growth Spiral, to draw a card, play an additional land this turn. Nature's Lore, Rampant Growth, Sylvan Scrying, and 3 visits. Sylvan Scrying, again, in here for that. Either one, we can go get any of our creature lands if we need them, or 2, go get that Yavimaya if we need to play into that forest strategy. I think Corrupt Rotation probably does the same thing, right? Go get a creature land if we need it, or play into this forest strategy if we need to do that, since we have a couple cards that care about it. Sylvan Awakening, another version of the instant we talked about, where we turn all of our lands into 2/2 elementals. Now this one gives them indestructible, which is great as well, whereas I don't think the other one did. So Sylvan Awakening's a little bit better, because then we don't have to worry about attacking or blocking or anything like that. They're just going to get in, and if they don't get blocked, then they're just going to deal good damage. Consuming Tide seems interesting. Each player chooses a non-land permanent they control. Turn all of the non-land permanents chosen away to the owner's hands, then you draw a card for each opponent has more cards in hand than you. Again, I like this because what we can do is turn all of our lands into creatures, play Consuming Tide. Everybody picks everything up except one thing they control, and then we might potentially get in for just some good damage. Consuming Tide, again, another kind of replacement for Cyclonic Rift in a lot of ways, but I think in a deck like this, you get to really take advantage of some of these, because all of our creatures are hopefully going to be land creatures in a strategy like this, or we're animating a lot of them. So I think we're going to get around this idea of just playing one card draw on the Ponder. I think we're going to have enough card draw, to be honest. We're going to have the ramp. We're going to have different things with the attacking and things like that. But I thought it's still a good idea to have one draw spell handy. Root Awakening seems kind of interesting. Choose one, untap all lands you control until end of turn. Lands you control will become 2/2 creatures that still land that are still lands, and then entwine for 2 mana. So for 8 mana total, we basically can go ahead and untap all lands and make them all into creatures. This is great, because if this is the last thing we do on a turn, we untap all of our lands, make them all into creatures, and get swinging. I think this is interesting. Again, this is another kind of version of an overrun card in our deck. But I kind of like it. I think it's kind of interesting. I think it's a little expensive, but I think this is a card that we try, and if we don't like it, we take this out for another overrun effect, or another card that could slot in and give us more utility. And then Part the Water Bill. I like having an extra turn spell or 2 in a deck every now and then, but Part of the Water Veil's in here because it fits the theme. For 9 mana, we can make a land into a 6/6 elemental creature with haste, and then take an extra turn if we want to. So I like it. It fits the thematics, and I think that's what's important. I love Part the Water Veil. It's one of my favorite extra turn spells of all time, just because it's Battle for Zendikar. I love Zendikar, and every time I play a landfall deck, I just think of Zendikar, and I feel like it fits so well. Getting up into our nitty-gritty stuff, we're playing one battle. We're playing Invasion of Zendikar. On the front side, we get 2 basic lands on the battlefield tapped, and on the back side, we get Awakened Skyclave, who is a land and a creature, so he's going to start attacking for Joriel for good value, and then taps for a mana. So I like this. It's not going to be hard to flip. It's only 3 defense counters, which isn't going to be hard at all. But those just 4 mana for 2 basic lands on the battlefield tapped. I love it. I think it fits the strategy really well. And especially with this little bit of landfall we're trying to do in the back end. Here's where we talked about our needing that Yavimaya in Nissa Synonymous, the -7 +1/+1 on each of our creatures for each force we control and trample. Here's our example of an overrun. Make all of our land creatures make our lands into creatures. Use this ability, give them all trample. I'm probably going to end the game that way. Her +1 can get us a big creature token, which isn't bad either. And the -1 destroys something. So Nissa can come down for 5, 6, or 7 mana, and depending on what amount of mana or life you choose to pay is how many loyalty counters she comes down with. Nissa Vital Force seems kind of interesting. +1 makes a land into a 5/5 with haste until our next turn. The -3 returns a permanent from our graveyard to our hand, which is pretty good. That can help us get things back. Or the -6 says whenever land enters the battlefield under control, you may draw cards. So that's pretty good too, right? Because Joriel wants this land creature to be how many cards on our hands, so that fits pretty well. Nissa, who shakes the world, is great, right? Turning our lands into 3/3s. Well, here we go. Now we have a better chance of drawing with this Joriel. And then the -8 can just go get every forest in our deck. So that's pretty great as well. But I like Nissa because you tap all of your forests for an extra green. So anything that's a forest taps for additional green. Our Awaken the Woods tokens will tap for extra green, all of our, of course, basic forest, all of our lands that have the forest type. If we have a Yavimaya out, then all of our lands would tap for an extra green. So I like Nisso Shakes the World. Again, another reason to kind of use those search cards to go get Yavimaya. And then because I think we're drawing so many cards, I feel like Teferi Temporal Program fits the deck really well. Whenever we draw, we put a counter on it, and then we can make those spirits that get bigger as we draw. We can just pay 0 to draw, which is great for Joriel's ability, kind of just grow our hand a little bit. And then the -12, basically a one-sided Cyclonic Rift somebody, but instead of going to their hand, everything goes into the library. So I like that because basically we can potentially start affecting our opponents, getting things of our opponents out of the ways for our big attack. Well, we're going to go into all of the creatures in the deck. If you're not interested in hearing those go one by one, there is a deck list down in the description. Check that thing on out. Let me know what you think. But we're going to go through the creatures, and then we'll wrap this thing on. First up, we have AC, Tyrant of Gyre Strait. Whenever we land enters the battlefield, draw a card, and then we can play an additional land. I think this is great because we want Joriel wants us to have as many cards as we can in our hand. So I think AC fits that really well. It's also just a 5/5 body. So if we have some buffs out, if we have some things out, it's going to hit hard. Like sees comes in as a land, but then eventually just becomes a 12/12. I love a card like this for this deck. Early mana when it comes down, and then it just becomes a big beater that if we can give trample, it's going to be hard for our opponents. I love Ashaya in this deck because it turns all of our non-token creatures into lands, which means for Joriel, then all of them are going to draw us cards when they attack. Ashaya is going to get huge, which I love, and then I love it because then all of our non-token creatures can become forests that can tap for mana and do things for us. I love Ashaya. It's one of my favorite modern landfall cards and elementals because it just stretches out so many great things, but also for this Consuming Tide and this Filter Out, it turns all of our creatures into lands, so they can't be bounced with a Cyclonic Rift or something like that. And so I think there's some benefit to that. Augur of Autumn can let us play lands off the top, or can let us play spells off the top of our library. I like this. Again, a good way to look at the top and kind of see what's coming, play some things off the top, and kind of know what the top card of our library is to plan ahead in case we can draw. Adventure of Zendikar, we're playing a landfall deck. Why not put in the big boy? Makes those plants when it comes in equal to the number of lands you control. Every time a land comes in, all your plants get +1/+1. I love AOZ in this deck because we're still trying to do the landfall thing anyway. I think AOZ is just another way to push our strategy forward, get our game going, and then it's going to be more things for our opponents to deal with. It's not just going to be us animating these little land creatures and they have to deal with that. Here, now you have this big boy who's just going to put some plants down and get going. Azusa, we're playing landfall. We need some sort of additional lands effects, and why not have Azusa for it? Get us going quickly. But I think the thing about Azusa and something like AC in this deck is we're not just strictly playing these extra lands to get ahead on mana, but if you think about it, we're playing the extra lands so that we have lands to animate that aren't going to affect the spells we need to play, right? If we have some extra lands down, we can animate them, and then we won't have to worry about having not enough mana to do the things we want to do. Embodiment of Insight, finally getting play in a deck, right? Here's a card that gives all of our land creatures vigilance, which means we can attack with them and then tap them for mana. And then whenever a land enters the battlefield, we may have a land become a 3/3 with haste. So here we go. Here's another way to make some more land creatures, even when Joriel's out. And I like that. Allows us to get more creatures, potentially draw more cards with Joriel as we're jumping in. Green Sleeves, another one of my favorite modern landfall elemental creatures. Just a star where stars know our lands we control, so it's going to get big. But then every time a land comes in, we get a 3/3 Badger. I love this because we're getting more tokens. They can be blockers. They can be other attackers. I just like it. And then Green Sleeves is going to get pretty big and pretty hard to deal with. Inga and Eska seems like an interesting card in this deck, but I think it's because it says creatures you control have vigilance and add 1 mana of any color. Spend this mana to only cast a creature spell. So it gives all of our creatures the ability to tap to cast other creatures. But what I like about this is all of our land creatures are now just going to flat have vigilance. So now we don't have to worry about tapping them, and we can tap them after for mana. And then it says if you cast a creature spell, if 3 or more mana from creatures was spent to cast it, draw a card. Well, this is great because all our little tokens we're making can tap for mana, potentially draw us cards that way. Again, just fill our hand, get more things into our hand is the name of the game here. Kamal, Heart of Krosa, kind of one of our overrun finishers at the beginning of combat. All creatures we control get +3/+3 and trample, and for 2 mana we can make a land into a 1/1 creature. So this does twofold. It helps us out with combat by pumping up all our creatures, and then it can make lands into creatures for us on the back end as well. Love a card like Kamal. Yes, it's a lot of mana. We're in blue-green. We're going to have a ton of mana laying around, and we're going to have plenty to do with it. Llanowar Loam Speaker. As a card I thought would be interesting. One, it's a mana dork, which is never unhelpful in a deck like this. But number two, that just tap something becomes a land becomes a creature. No mana involved. Have to do it as a sorcery, but we can just tap and do this. I like this. Loam Speaker can either tap for mana on that turn or make one of our lands into a creature and kind of give us that attacking benefit with Joriel on that turn. So I like a card like this. Lotus Cobra, one of your classic landfall cards, netting you mana as lands come in. I like it. It's helpful here. The earlier we get it, the more value we get from it. Scooty, gotta play Scooty in a landfall deck just because it does such a good job of just overrunning the board by itself. This +1 of those Nissas or one of those overrun effects is going to come hard for our opponent the more and more Scoot Swarms we have. So I like Scoot Swarm. It does a good job at either taking over the game by itself or forcing someone to remove it, which is never a bad thing when you have other things on the battlefield you don't want your opponent to remove. Silverback Elder. Whenever we cast a creature spell, we can either get rid of an artifact or enchantment, look at the top 5 and put a land on the battlefield tapped, or gain 4 life. We have a lot of creatures, but I think for Silverback Elder, we really like that middle ability, getting more lands. But we can do some different things, destroy the artifact or enchantment, gain life. I like Silverback Elder. It's probably the odd man out when it comes to the creatures here because it looks the least obvious as to why it's here, but I think it's worth trying stuff like this. And if you don't like it, you can always bring in some of those more classic landfall creatures if you want to. Sylvan Advocate, a card that I think shines here because of its ability. As long as you control 6 or more lands, it and other land creatures get +2/+2. So here we go. We make a 1/1 land creature off Kamal. It's 3/3. Joriel, anything Joriel makes gets +2/+2. I like Sylvan Advocate. I think it works really well for here. We're playing our pair of Tadiovas. They're really our mini commanders in the deck. Tadiova Bent Druid, of course, just draws us card every time a land comes in. This pairs so well with Joriel because it makes our hand even bigger and even better that way. And then Tadiova, whenever a land comes, or Steward of Tides from Dominaria United, land creatures we control have flying. So all of the land creatures we make have flying, which is great because that's going to help us get in for more damage. And then whenever a land comes in, if we control 7 or more, we can make a land a 3/3 with haste. So this is great because it makes land creatures as well. I love these cards that say land creatures you control have X because it just helps our strategy even more. Yes, Joriel already gives that land. It makes flying. But I think this is going to help with all of the rest of the land creatures we make and making them better. Toski just seems like a great fit. A little expensive of a card, but I think it fits here well. Whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. It has to attack if able, which is fine. It's a 1/1 with indestructible. We're not worried about Toski, but we like that benefit of drawing every time we hit somebody, getting access to more cards in our hand, churning through our deck, finding the things we love, and then eventually just having a big hand that Joriel can turn into a big creature. Uro seems like a cool and fun card here. Whenever it comes in the first time, we get that 3 life, draw a card, put a land down, and then it sacrifices itself, and then later in the game, it just comes back as a 6/6 that does that every time we attack. Every time we attack, gain 3 life, draw a card, and then put a land from our hand onto the battlefield. I like that. It's going to help us not only churn through our deck just a little bit, get an extra landfall, but it's just a 6/6, so it's another good target for attacking, blocking, whatever you may need it to do. Wake of the Wild seems interesting. Double green and X, put X counters on a land. That land becomes a creature with haste. It's still land, so it just becomes a creature all the time. Seems kind of like an interesting effect. I don't know how much use it's going to get. But what I think I like about this is if we have a ton of extra mana and nothing else to do with it, we just make our land into a huge creature and attack with it. So I like that about Waker of the Wilds. Again, I'm like Silverback Elder. I see the benefit of this card, but I also feel like it could be a trap sometimes. So maybe this, after some testing, comes out for something else, but I like the idea of it. And then Eudora seems like an interesting card. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, it can be returned to the battlefield face down under its owner's control. It's a forest. So I like this because if we have a creature that dies and we don't really have anything else to do with it, we can bring it back as a land, and then we have an extra land that we can play to do things. Again, I see the good of Eudora in a deck like this, but I also kind of feel like maybe there's other cards in slot that we could use. Again, this is why these deck lists are the 1.0 versions. We're still figuring the decks out. We're still figuring a lot of these nitty-gritty things out. And I think Eudora, to me, would be a potential one to kind of flag and come back to later as we see how the deck runs with it or without it. But what do you guys think of Joriel? Let me know down in the comments. This is a deck that, honestly, I was really surprised that I liked. You know, I've been messing around with landfall decks for a really, really long time. I think I found the 1 or 2 that I really like, but I was looking for the idea of a Simic landfall deck. You know, I really like Tadiova Benthic Druid, but I was never able to find a real list for that deck I loved or that I felt like had what I wanted from it. But I think Joriel could have it. I like the idea of the land creatures. You're still getting into combat. You can still play the combat enablers. the overruns, the things like that to get into your opponents. But you're also getting value by just putting a bunch of lands down, because then your lands become bigger, right? They become better. They become more deployable for the things you want. So I like Joriel. I think she's an interesting choice for a new landfall commander in a lot of ways, or lands matter commander in a lot of ways. Because yes, we get all of them all the time, and yes, we've gotten a bunch in Simic, but I think she fits her own spot, and I like that about commanders that feel different. They feel like their own, and they feel like they have their own play pattern. Yeah, she's kind of similar to the new Tadioba, right, where land creatures, but I feel like the thing here though is that land comes down with evasion, and you get a card every time you attack with a land creature, and that's not something anybody else has. So I think it takes your strategy and widens it to all land creatures as opposed to just the ones that you make off your landfall trigger with that new Tadioba, or just making them off of landfall triggers. Now, no matter what land creature we have, it's going to draw us a card. It's going to gain us value. And I think that's something that I'm intrigued to see how that would play on the tabletop if I eventually choose to give this deck a go. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Like if you like this content. Subscribe if you want to join me on my quest out brew your favorite Magic channel. And we've got lots more Aftermath coming, a lot more fun coming. Man, in just a few short weeks, we will be at Lord of the Rings, and I can't wait to discover more of that content and do that. But other than that, that's all I have for you guys, and I will catch you guys next time.